Hey, Jen's a natural resources specialist with Arlington County. Although she spends a lot of her time working to control invasive plants, Jen also works at the county's native plant nursery, so she understands both the native plant and invasive plant worlds. Prior to becoming a natural resources specialist, she was a naturalist at Arlington's Gulf Branch Nature Center. All right, guys, take it away. Jen, it's all you. Thank you so much. We look forward to it.
Sure. I thank you all for having me here. I am not sure when I share my screen if I'm going to be able to see the chat or hear. I think I should still be able to hear you, but feel free at any time I'll try to remember to pause for questions, sharing things, but feel free to speak up or something like that. Because like I said, I don't think I'll be able to necessarily see the chat or anything like that. So I'm going to share my screen. And I hope that I am now sharing my screen.
Yep, we can see it.
You are.
It's in,
I need to get the slideshow. There it is.
yeah.
Not sure why. Beginning. Okay. And I'm just gonna make you all small. All right, so thank you for having me again. I'm going to be talking about invasive species. Almost all my work focuses on invasive plant species, but I'll try to mention a few other things going on as well. And I think all of us are familiar with invasive species. Certainly we're, as tree stewards, are familiar with invasive species as invasive vines. But there are like a lot of different kinds. There's invasive vines, invasive trees, invasive bushes, invasive things that are herbaceous, little plants on the forest floor, invasive grasses, invasive ferns, all sorts of invasive species. And then the other thing to kind of remember, though it's harder for me to remember because it's harder for me to do anything about, are some of the other invasive species. These are invasive pathogens, invasive insects. So while we may see the vines on a tree or group of trees, sorry, I don't know why my screen keeps advancing for me. There are places where you just drive by and the 2/3 of the plants in the forest appear to be dead. That might be emerald ash borer or something like that. I think we don't even remember what chestnut blight was like and the impact it had in our woods at a time when chestnuts used to be the dominant tree in so much of our forest. We think of oak hickory forests. They used to be chestnut oak forests before we lost the chestnuts. So butternuts, laurel wilt, beech disease. There's 2 different kinds of beech disease coming through or headed our way. So a lot of these pathogens or diseases or insects are also invasive species. Of course, I think it's always, when I'm talking about invasives, not every non-native plant is invasive. We have our native dogwood trees, we have our non-native apple trees, and then we have non-native invasive species, like for this example, tree of heaven. So yeah, invasive species are not native and they are causing economic or ecological harm. So just always important to kind of frame that, I think. They're not inherently evil, they don't set out to destroy our forests or destroy our world. They're just in the wrong place, usually. And then when they're in this other place, they have a competitive advantage. So they might produce thousands and thousands of seeds. They might produce a chemical in their roots that suppresses the growth of other plants. They might leaf out early in spring before other species do and be blocking that sunlight and just getting that additional carbon boost to the system. They might put a lot of their growth in their energy into growth rather than carbon storage. They don't have the predators, the pests, the whole web that they'd be part of is lost when they come here and they're out of place. So, you know, the things that would normally keep them in check and in balance are gone. And sometimes some of that can kind of come back, but usually there's a huge disadvantage. The other thing I think is that a lot of the invasive species that people have moved here on purpose, we deliberately selected the most fast growing things, the most vigorous things, the ones that would cover the ground. So we were almost picking the ones that had the most advantage ourselves. I've seen ads for porcelain berry, which I sort of assume most of you are familiar with, from the 60s, and they're like, oh, it has beautiful berries, which is true, and oh, it'll cover your porch in just one season. I mean, this was an advantage of the plant when it was first brought here, so they definitely come with these advantages. And so they're not part of the system, they're not part of the food web, they're not part of other loops that occur and spread. And
Hey,
I'm going to
again,
pause there.
sorry to interrupt, but we had a question in the chat that related to your last slide. Someone wanted to know what the root was.
Oh, that is Oriental bittersweet. So that's an invasive vine. It I think I have a picture of it a few later, but not of the root in that slide. And so this is one that if you pull it out and the root is that orangey red color, oops, you pulled the right thing. And if you pull it out and it's not that color, you pulled the wrong thing and you put it back in the ground and pat it down again real quick and hope no one noticed. But yeah, that's Oriental bittersweet. That's the root of that. And again, it's putting a lot of its energy into storage in the roots, and it's putting its energy into growth, and it's not, you know, building a woody trunk or anything. And this is one that'll grow around trees and strangle trees. So I'm just going to sort of pause. I assume as you're all tree stewards, you all had your training, you all are familiar with invasive plants in general. But, and I know some of you just knowing, like, do, you know, go out and remove invasive plants regularly. So you're kind of aware of what this can look like. They impact our plant communities, creating a monoculture. We lose the trees themselves. We lose the ability of the next generation of trees to come up. And then the impacts of those plant communities also impacts our wildlife. And one thing I just wanted to sort of mention that I think we don't always cover or think about is that these impacts cascade through the system. It's not just that, oh, we don't have that tree anymore. That tree is covered with vines. You know, losing trees can mean more sunlight reaching the forest floor, which can mean drier and warmer soil on the forest floor. Losing trees and tree species, just right now, the leaves are starting to come down. They'll be falling. They'll be covering the forest floor. And I remember when I was studying and talking about wood frogs at the Nature Center, people have been doing studies on what kind of leaf litter on the forest floor and in the ponds that the wood frog tadpoles were growing up in, how that impacted the tadpole development and like the length of the legs of the tadpole and whether or not they were more or less likely to have tail deformities. All these different things were impacted by the kind of leaf litter that was in the ponds. And like another example is, different kinds of leaf litter decay at different rates. So I don't know how fast porcelain berry or kudzu leaf litter decays once those leaves turn brown. And if you have an area that looks just like a sea of vines and all those leaves turn brown and fall to the ground underneath it, I don't know how fast they decay or slowly they decay, but they've got a different, nutrient component to them and a different decay rate. And then that affects what kind of leaf litter is there, what kind of critters are in the leaf litter. If you think about the salamanders that might be in there, those are sort of your top predators. What are they feeding on in the leaf litter? Oak leaves are classic, like they stick around longer. than tulip poplar leaves. And so as you shift your species and everything, maybe your leaf litter isn't there as long, and maybe that means there's less habitat for the springtails and the mites that are the food for the salamanders. So there's just all these sort of cascading effects, carbon cycling and nutrient cycling in the leaf litter. So for all these different direct impacts of invasive species, we're just starting to figure out the other impacts. I came across some study that this was where black cherry, which is a native tree for us, was in forests. It was an invasive species in forests in Europe, and it was affecting the shrub biodiversity and the shrub biomass in the forest when they had different canopy trees. So just all these different connections we hardly ever think about, and they're impacted by invasives. To get to trees directly, you know, the vines, it's easy to see what a vine is doing to your tree, how it's impacting that. And then the vines on the forest floor are also preventing regeneration. A lot of our bushes, they're smothering seedlings, they're releasing allelopathic chemicals. Our herbaceous species, again, are releasing allelopathic chemicals that prevent seedling germination. They're monopolizing resources. They're just changing that environment on the forest floor. And this is not, these are just plants. And, you know, as we said, we have all these different other invasive species. There's mycorrhizal associations. There's associations with nematodes and fungi and all this stuff that's going on. And you know, we don't quite see all the connections, and we're just starting to learn about them. So the other thing, I think this is mostly just a depressing talk. I think that's what it is about invasive species, is that our environment is already experiencing a lot of stressors. We are an urban environment. We are a very fragmented environment. And the soil has been disturbed and compacted and removed, and the topsoil layer has been lost at times. So all that's happened. And then we're experiencing the impacts of climate change, and that's an additional stressor, you know, on our forest, on our natural communities. And to me, it's like, if you think of like my little picture, the brownie pan or whatever, if you think of your brownie dough as your nature in the raw or something, and you put a little less water in the dough and you put it in the oven and you start cooking it, it's going to get drier, crustier, and we can all like a crusty brownie, but you're going to, if you have a big square pan, in the middle, you might have some dough, some batter that stays moisture, stays more in its natural state, its raw state. But when you start putting in all these edges, and almost all of our parks are very edgy, you get the whole thing is cooked, you know, all the way through. So where we can find larger contiguous square chunks of land, that's always where we might have this intact area in the middle. But around here, we have very little intact forest and intact core of our woods. Any questions, comments? I find it very bizarre talking without being able to see people.
There's a question in the chat from Scott about distinguishing native bittersweet from oriental bittersweet. Is the color of the root the way that you use to distinguish between them?
No, it is not. Let me just, I think I took out my pictures of, there's bittersweet. I'm going to jump to this. So this is the non-native bittersweet here. This is the oriental bittersweet or Asian bittersweet. The leaves are going to be very similar. The native plant is also going to sometimes have these little lenticels, these little dots on the bark. The difference of the native and non-native bittersweet is that in the non-native bittersweet, the berries are all along, you'll see them growing out of the stem. If I can see, like there's some growing here, there's some growing down here, there's some coming out up here out of this vine. So there'll be lots of little places where we get these, the fruiting structure, the berries. In the native one, the fruiting structure will only be at the ends of the vines. So you won't have it growing all the way along the vine. You wouldn't have something like this here. It would just be at the end of it where there's a little cluster at the end. So it's less heavily fruity, if that makes sense. I also know we don't have native bittersweet anymore in Arlington. I doubt we have it in Alexandria. They may still have it in Fairfax. So at least in Arlington, we don't have it. Every now and then I'll come across native honeysuckle. We do still have a little native honeysuckle in our parks, but we don't have any native bittersweet except where it has been planted, like in a demonstration native plant garden or something like that. So we've just lost that species here, which makes ID easy in a sense, I suppose. But yeah, it's all the berries are going to be clustered at the tips of the vines instead of sort of spread along it, like with the non-native bittersweet. It produces a lot more fruit. So yeah, I'm gonna just jump back here. Okay, so here we are. We have all these invasives. They're doing really well here. We are spreading them around faster and faster. There's, some 400 different invasive like insects and pathogens and stuff like that are moving around, and hundreds of invasive plant species. And so as tree stewards, we do rely on you guys to understand that these are an issue and communicate that concern to others. If it's, I do, when I'm sharing this with people who haven't already, drunk the tree loving Kool-Aid or the native plant loving Kool-Aid or whatever it is, I don't try to tell them they're wrong. I don't try to, sometimes they are wrong, but yeah, no one learns when they're told that's bad, that's wrong, you did the wrong thing. It's like, oh, you meant to do the right thing, and this was a good step forward that you took. Now you can take one more step forward and do this. Like you planted a plant, you wanted to beautify your yard, you wanted to, have something nice that other people could enjoy, that you could enjoy. And now you can take one more step and make it something that wildlife can also enjoy. And you might get to, that kind of thing. So helping people, meeting people where they are, bringing them forward. And then also, modeling good behavior, having that boot brush in your car so you can clean the mud off your shoes before you move seeds, and taking a minute to do that when you get back from a hike with people and they'll see you do it. Going out and just removing invasive species yourself, thinking about asking a question, even if you're not going to buy that plant, really, you're at the garden center and you say, oh, excuse me, do you know if this plant is invasive? Even if you weren't going to buy it, and oh, thank you very much. It's the people working at these centers don't know usually, or, it's not they're not the ones in charge of those decisions, but just being seen and being heard, making a difference. Invasive species involve a lot of things. They sleep. We don't really notice them. And then we start to see them popping up here and there more and more. And then, so they're down here. Oh, I'm starting to see a few of these things. And then all of a sudden, there's more and more and more of them. They're all over the place. I think people start to recognize them. And then at that point, you're just managing infestations. You're not actually controlling the species. You're not going to eradicate it. You're not going to stop it. The only time you can do that is down here in this early stage. So for a lot of what we're doing and what we are looking to the tree stewards to do, I was actually doing this training, a different training, but the same thing with master gardeners this morning, is get people who pay attention to plants, to pay attention, to talk to other people, to try to move this invasive curve, this invasive response curve further to this side of the screen. Like, let's prevent these things from getting established in the first place. Burn firewood where you buy it. Don't move firewood. Don't move plants around. Don't, obey quarantine rules. When you come back from another country, think about what did, don't lie to the customs about some plant you bought or having your suitcase or something. I was just in Texas and they were having actually a native plant sale and I was really tempted to buy some stuff. And then I was like, I'm just not going to move this around. Or get it bare root or something like that. Think about what's in the dirt that you might be moving. Clean your lawn furniture if you are buying a bunch of lawn furniture from some other place before it gets moved. Clean it. So, and then of course, just the going out there and doing the work, getting the vines off the trees, getting this stuff off the forest floor, giving everything a chance to regenerate, a chance to kind of grow. Everything's dealing with enough stress out there. We're all dealing with enough stress, and so are the plant communities and the wildlife that they nourish. So whatever we can do for them. Here's some of our most common vines that we have. I think a lot of you are familiar with a lot of these, but I just wanted to highlight a few that this time of year are easily learned, very distinguishable, sort of stand out right now. Here's my little cartoon. So, sweet autumn clematis. This is one I've seen spread in the last 5-10 years around here. It has white flowers. You'll see it covering a fence. You'll see it cut up in a bush. You'll see it get 10, 20, 30, 20, 30, maybe 30 feet off the ground. I haven't seen it more than 20 usually. The flowers of sweet autumn clematis are very fragrant. It smells really nice this time of year. And the last few weeks also, I think we're kind of getting past peak bloom. And then another name for this plant is old man's beard. It has, after it flowers, it gets these sort of like, I don't know, tendril, little fluffy, feathery, white seed heads. And then all the little seeds go flying off everywhere. So there is a native clematis that has toothed leaves, but it also is not fragrant. So if it smells really nice and it's pretty, then it's the invasive species. So just be aware of this. This is still for sale. And I don't know if you've seen it in your neighborhoods or your parks, but did anybody notice this in bloom or smell it this fall?
Yeah, I saw tons of it on Theodore Roosevelt Island. I didn't know what it was. Now I do.
Okay. Yeah, that's what it is. I feel like it was more a couple weeks ago. I didn't really notice it as much this year myself somehow, but I think it still is in bloom and starting to go to seed. So another one that this time of year, very distinctive, and especially in the next month or two, still has leaves on it. A lot of our plants still have leaves on them, but they're starting to lose the leaves, and what remains then will stand out more is the Oriental Bittersweet. There's some places where you're driving up the GW Parkway, like right before you get on the Beltway, just like a haze of orange in the trees. And you'll notice it after the leaves have fallen, and you'll see this plant. So something to be on the lookout for in the next month or so. And like I say, there is a native bittersweet. Most places if you're in Arlington, Alexandria, most places it's the Oriental Bittersweet, the non-native one. And then the other one, which again, I think most people know, but this is a good time of year if you weren't sure if you had porcelainberry or wild grape, and you didn't want to try to look at the bark, and you weren't sure when you cut it, if the pith, that very core of the plant, was white or brown. Maybe you'd cut it too high, too low. Sometimes it can be a little hard to tell. When porcelainberry has its berries, it's very distinctive. So I think everybody's familiar with this plant, but just wanted to throw it out. This is a good time of year to just mark something and be like, okay, that is for sure porcelainberry. You may not get to it right now, but you can be aware of it, mark it, and come back to it later when you have time. So those were just sort of like a few top fall vines I just kind of wanted to mention. Here's a list of invasive plants for sale if anybody would like them. Don't spend your money at the store. I'm happy to give you all of these for free if you come and dig them out of the park, but just, be aware that this is still an ongoing thing. As tree stewards, most of these are not trees. I think Callery pear is the only really common invasive tree that's out there that people might be buying or planting. I have seen Japanese maple be invasive, but unless people's yards back up to a natural area, I haven't really seen it spread blocks away into the woods. It's all coming from somebody's backyard. And then mimosa is another invasive tree. Again, I know of other places where it's more of an issue. Here, it doesn't seem to be as much. Norway maple is definitely a tree that we have. I forgot about Norway maple when I made this list. So just urging people to go with a native tree where possible. And, I would say the other places that we can make the real difference are any non-native grass is probably a problem or going to become one, and any kind of ground cover that's non-native is probably a problem or going to become one. The ground covers and the grasses. There are certainly shrubs, there are herbaceous plants, there are vines, but that's where I see a lot of the issue these days. So again, just thinking about what we can do at the early stage of things here is key. And then does anybody have any, I'm just going to pause again for a, okay. So in Arlington, we are working our way through 500 some acres. We've got about 300 acres in some kind of management. So about 200 acres left to go, but we're more than halfway done. Not done, but parks where we've got the invasive species are still present, but they're no longer having big impacts, obvious impacts to the ecological function of the park. They're no longer sources of invasive plants. There may still be English ivy on the ground. There may still be porcelainberry, little bits here and there, but it's not producing a lot of seed. That seed isn't leaving the park, moving to another area. So we do biological control, and this is just something I wanted to sort of share. I think some of you may be aware of this, but this spring and summer, this is Vincent here, who I think all of you know, and Alonzo and John, Marlin, our deputy division chief. We got ubious wasp larvae, which are parasites on emerald ash borer. So basically, we have these little medicine vials, and inside it was a coffee filter that had the larva on it. And we opened the vial and there was a little screen cap and hung it up in the ash trees in Barcroft Park and in Benjamin Banneker Park. And we're going to participate in this program again next year and put more of we got 6 shipments, and we went out 6 times and put these little vials with the wasp larvae out in the parks, and hopefully they hatched and spread out and found some emerald ash borer beetles to eat. Or they don't actually eat the beetle, but they parasitize the larvae of the beetle. And that it should be some better protection for our ash trees as this eventually gets established. So there are a couple different species of EAB parasites and parasitoids that they're trying to release. And this is the one that we got. And these wasps are, like, if you were trimming your pinky fingernail and you took a little fingernail clipping, like, they're smaller than a grain of rice. It's very harmless, very hard to find. Again, we're probably not going to find them. We're going to look for signs of their impact on the larva of the EAB is the way to sort of tell if you've successfully got generations of these wasps out there. But that was a cool thing. So we are trying to control not just invasive plant species, but we are also looking at pathogens and insect species and stuff as well. Fairfax has been doing this for years. I mentioned that we rely on Fairfax. Fairfax has a forest pest health division, and they were the ones who hooked us up with this program and are going to help us do the monitoring and everything as well. So that was cool.
John, someone asked, Kelly asked in the chat, how do you know that the wasps won't become invasive?
Yeah, so this was, then we'll have to release, the dogs to chase the cats, to chase the mice, and just kind of keep going. I think that they've gotten, we can't know for sure, right? The process to get something, to get permits to use something as biocontrol, it takes them 10 or 20 years these days to isolate those species and make sure that they hopefully will not jump. So they'll find something that in the native habitat, that's for plants, let's say, here's my mile a minute, this weevil on the mile a minute, that triangular leaf with the thorns, is something that we released about 10 years ago in Arlington and in the area. So they'll find something that only eats that species. They'll try several generations of like trying to find other things that are as closely related to mile a minute as they can. So there's oak species. Let's say you find something that eats white oak, and you feed it every other oak leaf you can find. And will it jump to willow oak? Will it jump to red oak? Will it jump to post oak? You try to see if it'll do that. And then they also check, will it jump to any other trees in the forest? And so they try it on beech leaves and on maple leaves. Will it jump to stuff on the herbaceous layer? They try it on spicebush and maple leaf viburnum. And they try it also on, they try to see if they can get it to eat important crops. What if this thing also, for some reason, can become a pest on corn or wheat or apple trees? So there's a really long winnowing process with these species, and they might start with 20 or 30 species and get down to 1 or 2. And then they have to go through a multi-year review process with all sort of, scientific boards, federal boards. And it's gotten much more stringent. I think in the early years of biological control, it was a little less stringent. And, they did have some cases where like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have released X to chase Y. But I think that things have gotten, I can just hope that the process, is valid. I know there's a lot of pressure when something comes out like spotted lanternfly or emerald ash borer. It's devastated millions and millions and millions of acres of ash trees. People they want a solution. They're losing like half the trees in their forests in some of these other areas of the country. There's a huge pressure to solve it. The fact that it's still, no, we're looking at, 10 years later, they're like, okay, now we think we've got something. So this isn't something they come to right away. It's also something where I think there's some sort of cost, but there is a risk, and they decide, that the risk is worth it for the benefit that it might bring to being able to have ash trees as a large part of your forest again or something. So yeah, it's just like using herbicide in the forest. You're changing things in the forest. When you go out and you rip invasive plants out of the ground and you disturb the soil, you're changing things in the forest, and you're sort of making that cost benefit analysis and hoping you're doing the right one. I hope that helps answer the question. And if not, whoever it was can speak up.
So, somebody also asked if Alexandria is doing something similar.
I don't know. Alexandria's forestry department is even smaller than ours. I mean, it's a smaller unit, I believe. I think they just have a few people, so they may not be doing this yet. I wouldn't be surprised if the idea is that, like, they were doing this in Fairfax. We're doing it now too. I think that eventually these species, if they establish themselves, will spread to Alexandria, but I don't know if they've released the EAB parasites there yet. But you know, like I say, Fairfax, I'm sure would offer to help with, you know, the process. I myself, I was talking to somebody and I was like, oh, it was one of our foresters who went to Fairfax, actually. I was talking to her and she was talking about how she did this. I was like, how much does it cost? She's like, no, it's free. You just fill out this like 2-page application process, and you have to say where you're going to do it, how you know whether there are ash trees there, what kind of impact you've been seeing to the ash trees in that park, all this information. But it's, if you're willing to do the paperwork, it was free. It was pretty cool. So, and the forestry unit will have to do more of the paperwork than I will. So it's a win for me. Let's see, chemical work. We do chemical work, herbicide application in our parks, trying to manage these species. That arrow was pointing to a single wavy leaf basket grass plant that was right there. This was an invasive, can't remember what tree that was that we cut down. So using herbicide to control invasive species. This is something that those people who are looking at Tree of Heaven, and I assume you've had some sort of trainings specifically about Tree of Heaven or spotted lanternfly, or are going to?
Not yet.
Okay, well, spotted lanternfly officially now exists in Arlington County. It was one of those things where we knew it was here if you were popping up here and there, but they finally brought that sample into the Extension Service to be added to the list of places with spotted lanternfly. The population right now is very spotty, and people still don't know what you are if you dress up as a spotted lanternfly at Halloween, but they will know what you are soon. And we're just trying to get the word out to people that this is coming. There are going to be a lot of bugs for a while. They are harmless. They don't bite you. They don't sting. They don't make a loud noise like cicadas. They do suck on the sap, on the juice of a lot of species, not just ailanthus trees, not just Tree of Heaven. They'll go to maples. They'll go to grapes. They'll go to all kinds of things. But they do definitely prefer Tree of Heaven, and they'll reproduce on other species, but they reproduce more successfully with Tree of Heaven. So, and at a certain time in their life, they tend to like just flock to the Tree of Heaven, and the plants will be just crawling with these. You can almost not see the bark for all the spotted lanternfly that are on the plant. So people might want to think about either removing their Tree of Heaven, which you can't do by just cutting down. You'll get 100. Tree of Heaven will pop up from the roots, maybe more. And so what you need to do is kill the tree and then remove it. So it's a two-stage process. And we found that even like cutting it down and painting the stump, like in this case, it can work sometimes, certain times a year, but even that is tricky. I think, Noreen, you experienced that, right? Where Sue cut some down. Using like a basal bark herbicide seems to work best, where the tree doesn't even know it's been injured, and then it absorbs the herbicide and then it dies. Then you cut it down. Or you leave your Tree of Heaven standing, and when all the spotted lanternflies land on it, then you treat it with an insecticide, and all the spotted lanternflies sucking on the sap die. If you want to have a trap tree in your yard. But I would say if you know people with tree of heaven, you see people with tree of heaven in your neighborhood, just, hey, you might want to be aware this is coming. It's attractive spotted lanternflies. You don't need to panic. You don't need to run out and cut down the tree now. Again, you'll just get more of them. Start thinking about what you're going to do, how you're going to manage it. Maybe plant another tree so that in 3 or 4 years, when you take out your tree of heaven, you've got another tree kind of ready to take over. Like I said, in a few years, we'll have a lot of spotted lanternfly and everybody will be aware. So it's coming. So the other thing we do is we do mechanical removal. A lot of this is done by volunteers. There are many events in Arlington County. We have 2, 3 a weekend. There's one every Saturday, one every Sunday, sometimes 2 or 3 on a Saturday or Sunday. And then Alexandria has these as well, a little more sporadically, I think, but starting to have more regularly scheduled events. Rely on the tree stewards, master naturalists, everybody, the volunteers, scout groups, everybody to come out and do this work. And then also extra shout out to our site leaders who are there every month, if not more often, in the parks. And so our volunteers are doing sort of a couple different things. One is working in really small parks, not really small, but small parks where 1, 2, 3 people can kind of get things under control. I have a volunteer working in Fillmore Park in Arlington where she and like 2 or 3 other people really made a huge difference. This is just like a ½ acre, 1 acre park. In some places, volunteers are removing the seeds, getting the vines off the trees, buying time before we can get in there. In some places, they're doing those maintenance sweeps to make sure that these plants don't come back, catching them when they're still small, helping us out. And in some places, they're really tackling these larger vines and bushes and everything like that. The other thing is we are trying to do more early detection, rapid response, learning about species, finding them before they get established, before they're all over the place. So keep an eye out for this. We'll be doing this again in the spring for incised fumart, which is this purple flowered one that is spreading rapidly in our riparian areas along those stream valleys. I got a lot of panicked emails from people who love the bluebells in parts of Fairfax, down in Manassas, Oak Ridge, along the riverbanks and the Potomac, where they're seeing more and more of this plant, and it's really the other native spring ephemerals are disappearing. Haven't seen crow dipper, this wacky looking thing down here anywhere in Arlington, but I'm on the lookout for it. This is autumn fern, which the master gardeners were still buying and planting just a year ago, but we've started to see it pop up in our parks. It's not on the invasive species list yet, but it soon will be. So we'll be trying to go to demonstration gardens, go out to places with live examples of these plants, teach people what to look for. We need plant aware people noticing these plants. If you see them or any other sort of weird looking thing, let me know. Another thing that's super helpful is if you document it on iNaturalist. You see a plant in an area, you're not quite sure what it is, even if it's not a tree. Though we are on the lookout for, what is it, Szechuan peppercorn tree? They've had that in Montgomery County. Put it on iNaturalist, and then the regional Prism has, when they're staffed, which hopefully they will be again soon, has people who search iNaturalist. They're regularly pulling up reports of this stuff, checking the validity of the report, and then passing it on to the invasive manager for the jurisdiction. So I would get, hey, people have reported seeing such and such in this park, helping make me aware, helping us focus our energy so we can prevent these plants from getting established, catch them while they're still just spotty. The work does pay off. This is Lubber Run. It sometimes takes years. Here's Lubber Run covered with ivy. here's Lubber Run with nothing on the forest floor. Here's Lubber Run, and all this is bloodroot. So, and we have areas where there's a really nice diverse plant community there on the forest floor now. So it is worth it. It does work. It's just a long process, I think, and an iterative one.
Jen,
Mhm.
someone, Mary is asking about the picture that you were talking about, something competing with bluebells.
This thing. This is incised fumart, or Corydalus incisa. Corydalis is how I used to say it, but I've heard other people say Corydalus incisa, incised fumart. There's a yellow flowering version of this that's native. And this is something that it's spreading rapidly in the area. We have it along 4 Mile Run. I think they found 2 or 3 plants along the Potomac. But yeah, in other areas they've got big patches of it, like big patches. So, and it's one that like its seeds will pop out and pop and spread. So if you go hiking where you see it and you got muddy boots in the spring, you know, clean your boots before you go for a hike along 4 Mile Run, I guess is what I would say. And I as I was saying before this all began, I'm guilty of that myself, but something we can all do. So I think I totally lost track of time while I was talking. So I don't know if I'm early or late on my.
You're good. You're still, I have a question, and I think people probably have a pretty good general sense of this, but could you just give a quick overview of the vines that cause damage to trees, and how they cause damage to trees, the invasive vines that climb and weigh them down? And
Yeah, I'm gonna, somewhere up here I had a whole list of vines. I gutted an earlier presentation too. Let me see if I can do that. So all these vines, what they do is there's different ways in which they damage trees. One thing they'll do is they'll just go up and they'll climb around it. Actually, I'm going to just go back to a normal. I'm going to escape from this. I'm going to stop sharing. Can you guys all see me?
yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
If the trunk they're trying to see is as it winds around when the tree is smaller, and then the vine itself expands, so it's putting pressure on the trunk of that tree, and it's also keeping the tree, like it's girdling the tree. So sometimes the tree is kind of being strangled at that point. So it'll be like that sort of stranglehold on the tree. I've seen vines that are also like under tension. If you find wisteria, and wisteria will not be growing right up against the trunk, a lot of times you'll see the vine on the tree, but the wisteria vine itself will be rooted somewhere else. Maybe it got started up a bush and that bush is no longer there. So the wisteria vine will be coming down out of the tree, and that vine is under tension. Like when you cut it, it springs apart almost. So it is literally pulling on the tree. These plants also, sometimes it's just that, like if you get a lot of the leafy canopy up over the tree, especially when they're young trees, or even when they're, small enough trees that the leaves of the plants can block the sunlight getting to the tree itself. They're getting all the sunlight, and the tree leaves are not getting that sunlight. So then the trees are kind of on a starvation diet where they're not getting all the nutrients, the energy they need. And then just the weight of these plants can also make the tree, especially some of these evergreen ones, if you think in the winter storms, the trees have mostly lost their leaves around here. When you have these evergreen vines and there's additional vines in the trees, that additional weight in a storm can like help cause a tree to be tapped in the wind or be pulled over. And then some species when they're holding the leaves, the green leaves against the trunk of the tree, they're trapping moisture there. And in that area where the vine is against the tree or the moisture is against the tree trunk, like fungal diseases and pathogens have an easier way getting in. So they may not be killing the tree directly, but they're one more stressor on the tree, and they're kind of making it easier for that tree to come down for other reasons. And then they also do, just like when they're covering the forest floor, the little seedling trees can't get through them. And then other ones are like actively preventing the germination. They're not even letting the seeds sprout or get started. So.
Okay. There's a couple of, like, I'm thinking Virginia creeper that does not harm the trees. They co-evolved with the trees or whatever, but I'm thinking like native grape.
Yeah, so native grape can be a problem for trees. Like a lot of our native vines, they will, like poison ivy, Virginia creeper, they lose their leaves in the fall. They're just growing like with little sort of sucker attachments, that little stuff on the side of the tree, and they're not going to surround the tree. They're just going to be on one side of it. So right underneath where that vine is, there might be some impact, but they're not all around the tree. So the tree does okay. And then the leaves fall off every fall. They come in as the tree leaves in. They're not going to do that total block. But like, I do know that, like, for some people, what they're trying to grow a lot of young trees or get a forest patch established, they will get native grape out of there if they're trying to, have a little bit of regeneration happening, and the native grape is really aggressive and smothering those young trees as they're trying to get them established. So, yeah.
Elizabeth is asking if ivy English ivy, I assume, on the trunk of a tree is always bad. I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, it's how bad it is depends on how large the vine is, how heavy it is. So yeah, but it's generally no, it's not going to do the tree any good, that's for sure. So, and then whether good site to point people to for educational purposes. There's a lot of information out there. I think it's kind of trying to figure out who your people are and what level of information they want. Do they want like a little 2-minute cartoon about invasives that's just kind of that, or do they want to deep dive into things? So I think it's hard to, do they just want to learn about a particular species?
Yeah, Jennifer, I posted that, and I was wondering, in general, like the spotted lanternfly and the tree of heaven, because I've got plenty of neighbors who have that, the tree of heaven.
So the extension service, our extension service has information. Pennsylvania is where this problem started, really. And the Penn State Extension has they've done most of the work for us already, quite honestly.
Okay, good.
And they've had years to work on their messaging with homeowners, their messaging with people who own vineyards, they've got a lot of resources. They've got everything from like a 30-second video clip, what is spotted lanternfly and why should I care, to 4-hour trainings on how to quarantine your fruit production vehicles or whatever it might be. So I would say that I would sort of browse around in Penn State's thing. It'll be Pennsylvania focused, and the Virginia extension does have some of that information, and more is coming out. But I think Penn State's a couple years ahead of where we are.
Yeah, because I know my neighbors, when they hear that and how it's going to be a magnet for them, I know they're going to be concerned. So I'd like to be able to present them with some things.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll look at Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And see what they've done
between the two? Penn State Extension.
Okay.
It's like the Virginia State Extension.
Okay.
Cooperative service, but they've got a lot of good stuff.
All right. Thanks, Jennifer.
Your songs about spotted lanternfly, whatever you want to do.
Right. I'll dress up like one for Halloween.
Yeah. I did a year or two ago, and everybody was like, "What are you?" And I was like, "Oh, you'll know."
right, great. Thank you.
Any other questions? I see that I have only got a few minutes left here before Charles comes on, but yeah, I'm trying to touch anything. Just, I appreciate the work you guys do, planting trees, protecting trees, getting the word out, doing whether it's like on your property, working with, people who live in apartments, people who don't own land. So many people in Arlington and Alexandria are not homeowners. The majority of people live in apartment buildings or multifamily homes. Taking the time to work with those people and just, yeah. So I guess that's all I've got.
I would just say I'm a park steward, a newly minted park steward, and I have a little strip of a little Hell's Half Acre strip or whatever. Jen is very familiar with it along the side of 4 Mile Run. But I would just say anybody doing invasive work, take a few minutes to make sure that that you're not accidentally pulling a look-alike native plant, especially with vines and stuff. Just get a invasive plant guide or look it up on the internet or something, and just make sure that you're pulling an invasive before you get too carried away cutting things.
Yeah, I will just say overall, if you want to do something outside your own personal property on public land, I sort of think of it as like it's not quite like picking up trash because it requires a lot more skill and a lot more knowledge, and you can mistake things for natives and invasives. There's a really good guide out of Delaware called Mistaken Identity that has the native and non-native species side by side. Like one page is the native species, one side is the invasive species. It's no longer in print, unfortunately, but it's called Mistaken Identity. I'll try to, I think if I feel like I'm going to message you, Noreen, and not everybody, but that's a great resource. But if you're out in the woods and you see an invasive plant and you just stop and get that one little English ivy vine off of something, you don't necessarily need to wait, talk to the authorities, do all that. But if you're going to take off more, like if you're going to regularly be out there picking up trash in a park, staff want to know. We want to know so that we can say thank you. We want to know so we make sure that you're, handling things safely and, don't get it sick from doing it. We want to know so we don't schedule a trash pickup the same day that you've just picked up trash. So, and for invasive plants, it's kind of like you see one thing, okay, we understand. If you really want to get out there and get a whole bunch of vines off a tree, or you want to get vines off several trees, please just contact somebody first, just so that we're aware of what you're doing. We're not going to say, no, never. We just want to know. Sometimes we'll just verify that you know what it is. What are you going to do with the vines after you've pulled them off or after you've cut them? How are you going to report those hours? Sometimes it's not actually public property and it looks like public property, and just making sure that there's none of those conflicts. Sometimes stuff, unfortunately, it's like, oh, well, that's actually not Arlington County Park property or Alexandria Park property. That's actually state right of way. And so you need to contact VDOT, and here's who to get permission from. So, making sure you know what you're doing, making sure you've got the right species, and then making sure that you do have permission to be doing that work. And then we can say thank you as well. So,
about the Mistaken Identity book, I found that on a used book site, but I also just real quick, I just Googled it and I found a PDF version from a Prism, Lower Hudson Prism website, and I'm putting it in the chat.
Yeah, so there's the PDF is out there in several versions, and it's free. It's public resource. Just they ran out of the printed copies, unfortunately. So, yeah. And then just like taking a little extra time to work on your. Not all vines are bad. I'm actually kind of concerned about our native grape. I know that it can be aggressive, but it's really it's a preferred species for spotted lanternfly, and was wiping out whole grapevines and vineyards, like really high mortality rates. And so nobody seems to know what that's going to do to the native grapes in the forest. Like I've asked people in Pennsylvania and they're like, we don't know what that will do to the native grapes in the forest and how much of an impact the spotted lanternfly will have on those populations. So we all make mistakes. I went out there and pulled a whole bunch of stuff I thought was baby kudzu one time, and it turned out to be a native vine called hog peanut. But that's why we try to work together with other people, double check our work, that kind of thing. So
Okay.
that's
That-
no other questions.
All
I'll
right.
you guys.
Thank you,
All right.
Jen.
Sure.
Thanks a lot, Jen. Really appreciate it.
Sure.
Always learn a ton. And guys, now we're going to segue over to our other speaker. And that's Charles Smith. He's a restoration ecologist who is branch chief with the Department of Public Works and Environmental Services. He has a background in natural resource management, wildlife management, and stormwater planning. He grew up in Arlington and is on the board of the Virginia Native Plant Society, as well as being active in other organizations, including the Audubon Society. He's been a longtime instructor for 3 different chapters of the Virginia Master Naturalists, but this is the first time speaking to us. So it's all you, Charles. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right, great. I appreciate that. And I'm hoping, let me try to share. Are you seeing the full screen version of the presentation?
We
Yeah.
are, yes.
Yeah.
It looks like it, yes.
Great. All right, good. I'm gonna try to get my screen to see here. Second. All right. Well, I really appreciate you guys having me this evening, and I'm going to overlap a bit with Jen. And I guess my hope was in kind of the email exchange with Noreen, preparing for this, was to bring some ideas about forest ecology and health. And I think my slides tonight, I'd love to hear feedback. I'd love to come back in the future if you guys would like to talk about more specific topics or to hone in more on maybe more urban systems. The first slide here actually is a Stream Valley in Fairfax County. It's a difficult run. And I guess the idea just to start it off is this is a very unhealthy system. This is a lower poor, lower fair, bordering on poor, probably poor forest stand. And the reason I say that is you see all the green there is non-native, and the overstory is essentially a monoculture of tulip tree. And what it really exemplifies is the long land use history, which involved a lot of disturbance. And that's one of the biggest issues that we are dealing with, is the latent effects of long-term land disturbance. So I wanted to go to a more positive note. This is one of my favorite species that we see very little of anymore. And this is bristly locust, which, if you guys are familiar with it, it's a wonderful native locust. So it's a pseudocaccia, and it was traditionally an edge plant. You'd see it along rights of way, along old hedgerows. It's just a wonderful native plant that I see less and less of. And this particular plant I took a picture of in Prince William County, where I lived for many years. And this was along a fence row, an old farm that got developed into housing, and they ripped down the fence row. So just not only the true forest stands, but also these edge areas and other plant species that have been either pushed to the margins, and then also in many cases their habitat too has been eliminated. So I think, thinking about how we perceive the natural world, I always think Alba Leopold's such a wonderful touchstone for how we interact with the other species that we cohabitate with on the planet. And this concept of going back from this domineering perspective to one of creating a community in which we can host native species. And that's really the name of the game. It's getting more native plant biomass into our landscapes, because we have truly converted much of the earth into our habitat, which is not conducive to other species in many cases. And then this is rather simplistic, but just thinking about forests, you have the really simple definition, which is just trees with undergrowth, a woodland, and then you have a little bit more complex, just thinking about complex ecosystems. And there are many different types of forests. And the other thing is I understand fully that we're often dealing with tree stands, in our developed areas. So we're, is it a forest? Is it not? Is it a forest fragment? Those are all good discussion points to have. But the key is trying to increase complexity in terms of number of species, the layers within the system, and all the different functions it provides and the species it supports. So the reason we're having this conversation in terms of health is this. It's us. We have converted an estimated 77% of habitable terrestrial Earth for our purposes. So we have altered all the habitats pretty much. There's very little untouched. So we're dealing with secondary and tertiary growth in our region. And how do we account for the kind of the land use history and the stressors that are affecting those systems? So this is kind of these are maybe the slides that maybe aren't anticipated, but really thinking about the larger context. We are in the middle of a mass extinction event. It says the 6th extinction, as it's been portrayed, or so. And this time it's us. So somewhere climate change, it's human caused, and so it's really habitat conversion. And it's estimated we've lost 50% of all plant biomass, terrestrial plant biomass, since the beginning of agriculture. Particularly in the last 100 years or so, we've converted much of what's left. And I think these numbers are pretty intense. The Virginia plants I'll get into a little bit more in a second, but just the number of species that may go extinct and are on the verge, and the conversion's been incredible. The one in this, thinking about the last, I mentioned the 70% of the Earth's land surface has been altered. It's greater than 70. Loss of about 50% terrestrial plant biomass. And what's left, a lot of that's agricultural biomass, which is not native to a particular region. It's been moved around. But in this last part, in the last 50 years, the amount of loss has been dramatic. So almost 70% of vertebrate species populations have been lost in the last 50 years. So these are really telling. And of course, birds are a wonderful barometer for that, with a 29% decline in North America alone in that time frame. And that's not accounting for some of the other losses of bird biomass. And Virginia tracks directly with the global numbers. So when we look at native plants, the floor of Virginia has about 3,200 species. About 2,450 are actually native. So about 750 are introduced. And then this year, the update on the plants that are threatened in some way, it ends up being about 39% of the total native plants numbers in terms of the species are in this rare or decidedly uncommon category. So the threats are pretty clear. It's really us primarily, fragmentation, land use conversion, and repeated disturbance of landscapes. This is the key, is that, we talked a little while ago, Jen was talking, or somebody asked about some of the natives, things like poison ivy and some of the other vines. In many ways, that the elevated amount of poison ivy is directly correlated with the disturbance regime. So you have lots of edge, and we keep redisturbing it. And it's one of those plants that can actually do well in that situation. So our invasives are similar. A tremendous percentage of invasives are a symptom of disturbed soils and disturbed landscapes. So that's really a lot of the issue you're dealing with in urban areas, is that disturbance regime. And then some of these other things is oversimplification. Invasives themselves, they're introduced by us. Deer herbivory, which is again a byproduct in many ways of us not managing deer. Since we have been the dominant predator of deer for the last 13,000 years in North America, despite the loss of other predators. And then just, again, most people are unaware, and they don't understand that, not only disturbing areas, but also introducing species that are not beneficial is problematic. One of the things we're also dealing with is we're still dealing with the latent effects of a 20th century vision, in which somehow if you stop disturbing it, it will go back to something good. Well, the answer is it will not. We have altered the landscapes. We have removed native plant species for a large percentage of our habitable area by humans. And the propagule density, the number of species present, particularly non-native plants, is so tremendous that often they're the ones that can exploit the disturbed footprint. So that's where your invasives come in. So instead of going back to a climax forest, if you leave it alone, it will go back to an area that's just filled with invasive species, autumn olive, oriental bittersweet, and, ailanthus. So we've got these propagule densities that are very high with invasives and these disturbed soil footprints and conditions that really favor invasives in many cases. So just as an example of this, this is in Western Prince William County at Silver Lake Regional Park. And this is a globally rare plant community. It's an upland depression swamp forest, a Piedmont variety. And when the land was first coming to the Prince William County, the Native Plant Society helped do an inventory. We identified this community type and worked with the Virginia Natural Heritage Program to document it and map it. And so you see this example was remaining, yet here on the left is that same system, and on the right, that used to be depression swamp forest, but in the 20th century it was cleared and the soil was disturbed. So what's left is basically red maple and Japanese stiltgrass. And it will not be anything other than that for any foreseeable future, for hundreds of years potentially, because the soils are so disturbed and you simply cannot recover it in a timely manner. So in protecting these intact cores is really critical because you really can't recover them in appreciable timescales. And this is, really what we do. We clear, we disturb down to an inorganic soil layer, and then there's not much left to build on. You've lost your plants, you have a disturbed condition, and it's often very compacted. We lose these horizons in the soil, which are so important for communities to be built upon, plant communities, that is. And then thinking about where we live. Now, these photos I took in North Carolina a number of years ago, but they're indicative of what we see in a lot of subdivisions, which is basically biological deserts. We see the fact that we strip the land and we put back turf and a limited number of ornamental species, and not much can live there. Now, some of our older communities, and this is just walking down the road from the one I just showed you, are more like parts of Arlington where I grew up. You do have some remnant larger trees that are native, and some shrubs and things that have a lot more texture and substance to them. They create not only the native species in many cases, but they also often have a structure and a pattern that's more conducive to supporting other organisms. So that's all positive. And I think that's the key to kind of build on, is we have some examples of that, and things we want to mimic are those positive things with structure, native plants, greater diversity in terms of the species, but also with the structure itself. And it was interesting because years ago, I remember going to Mount Vernon with my kids and realizing that there at Mount Vernon, they also gardened with native plants. So in some of the gardens, back in the colonial times, they were pulling in native species in the woods and growing them in their gardens along with the things they brought from elsewhere. So it's not a novel idea. It's not new to garden with native species. It's something that we can recapture and actually build upon. Another thing I want to emphasize, you've got these ornamental trees left that are beautiful. This is a very well-known oak tree in Prince William County on Davis Ford Road, an old farmhouse next to it. It's built about 1900. And this tree is several hundred years old and has incredible spread. But the thing I think it also exemplifies is the beauty of the organism is kind of belied by the fact that it's one organism sitting in turf. And that when that organism dies, what's left? And there's no structure underneath of it. It's mowed. There's excessive deer browse in that neighborhood. I know that because I lived in that neighborhood for 14 years. And it is kind of exemplary of how we often see organisms as kind of furniture that we put in a landscape and we admire it, but it's not really functioning as part of an ecosystem. So this picture is from the south end of Massanutten Mountain looking over Shenandoah Valley. And, as growing up, Shenandoah Valley to me, and it still is, a very special place. I had relatives that lived there and ancestry, and always thought of this amazing place. But in reality, much of the Shenandoah Valley is also a biological desert. It is a horticultural species that were introduced for agriculture, and biologically, it does not support much life. So you've got the remnants, which are up on the edge of the mountains. There's excessive deer browse there. So you really have strained conditions, even here in these rural areas. So after humans, deer are our number one stressor. I know that in many urban areas, invasive species are possibly more so than deer, but you can't underestimate the impact of deer browse, eliminating everything native, and then the invasives being able to outcompete, and often they're unpalatable to deer. So that it really is a significant impact on the landscapes. And the thing that is often overlooked is that deer exceed the ecological carrying capacity. And unfortunately, with game management, it's often talked about the cultural carrying capacity, which is our tolerance, and the biological carrying capacity, which is the number of deer landscapes can support without the deer population crashing. But what has to be remembered is that deer are resilient. They eat a lot of ornamental plants, and they love edge habitat, which we create. And the ecological carrying capacity is exceeded with about 15 to 20 deer per square mile, which is 640 acres. That's in the forested system. And once it's already stripped, fewer deer than that can actually keep it stripped. So this ecological carrying capacity is critical. And as early as 2008, well, actually the data go back to the 1970s, but as early as 2008, the USDA Forest Service declared deer after humans the number one threat to forests east of the Mississippi. So again, deer browse impacts are significant. This is a deer herd in Tyson's Corner, so you don't think they can't be everywhere. They can be. So this was about 16 deer hanging out in one of the last forests in Tyson's, and you see them everywhere there. I've been there numerous times. There's way too many deer, and the browse level is severe. This is in Fountainhead Regional Park off the Occoquan Reservoir. There's portions of this area that are so bad there are no squirrels. That's because the deer eat the acorns as well as every native plant that tries to come up. The one thing in this image is that because the soil profiles are still intact, you don't have invasive plant species, because these forest systems that have intact soil profiles, even if the deer are stripping out the understory and all the other plants, they can often resist many of the invasives. A lot of the research on deer browse has shown that essentially it's just a war of attrition. As they repeatedly browse the plants year after year, their root systems diminish. They obviously can't reproduce, and then slowly the plants die off. So they are locally extirpated. And this has been demonstrated with a lot of research from it's a Mountain Lake Biological Research area that's run by UVA. There was a report came out a few years ago, or a number of years ago now, orchids through Virginia and West Virginia, Maryland, that have been extirpated by deer browse. So tremendous amount of data on this. This is a couple examples of exclusion. On the right, Penn State in Pennsylvania has shown that if you're able to effectively fence deer out, you can recover large areas. And Pennsylvania has been the most aggressive at this, with fencing out hundreds of acres in instances. On the left is a park in Fairfax where they're attempting to do the same thing. But these are hard to maintain for larger areas. This is an example from Gettysburg National Battlefield Park. When they started culling deer, the trees rebounded. So this is regeneration after a couple of years of sharpshooting. That basically, I know for years I've been saying, if you reduce the deer enough, the trees plant themselves. That's the best way to go, is to harness biology and allow the natural ability to regenerate to occur, but you have to remove the browse stress first. Invasive species, Jen covered this at length, so I don't dwell on this too much. So you guys are very familiar with this. We have so many invasives that inhabit our urban areas. And then, Arlington, Alexandria are really on the cusp of that, because they've had ornamentals introduced for so many decades that they have high propagule density, so high concentrations of invasive species, lots of seed source, as well as asexual reproduction. I grew up in Arlington. I had to control English ivy as a kid, and I know that remember going to Roosevelt Island as a kid is one of the worst examples of English ivy invasion. Autumn olive is another really critical one. I know it's not as bad in many places in Northern Virginia, but in rural areas throughout Virginia, it doesn't matter where you are, autumn olive is taking over farm fields. It was also actively planted by game management people up through the 1980s and early 90s, as they thought it was a good game plant. We know now, not only is it an allelopathic invasive, so in other words, it suppresses plants around it, but those berries do not provide the right food at the right time of year for our birds. So that was a wrong premise. And then Oriental bittersweet, one of the worst examples of Oriental bittersweet I've ever seen is the Huntley Meadows Park. Portions of that park have been overrun, and many of you have probably worked on controlling Oriental bittersweet over time. And then there are many examples of people working with mechanical means, and many of you have also, I'm sure, trying different methods to curtail the growth and spread of many of these plants and eliminate them. Jim had some great examples from Lover Run. I remember going there as a kid, and I didn't know the difference when I was a kid, playing Lover Run. But clearly, the efforts of people repeatedly over decades removing invasives and letting native plants recover. This is an example. Of course, goats get a lot of positive press when they're used. Their applicability of goats, though, is kind of interesting because we priced it out for Natural Resource Management in Fairfax. We did a pilot with them, but it's difficult because you have to have a herd. You have to be able to fence them in. They eat everything, native and non-native, and then when the resprouts come, you usually have to use chemical application to kill the root system. So, but they're a really interesting tool if you can use them. And then thinking about, again, the different types of control methods, and trying to what resources you have, what you're allowed to use in a given site, of course, timing and many other factors that come into play. I wanted to emphasize that you talked before about reverting to a good condition after eliminating disturbance, and it did occur. So, of course, it used to be the model that was developed in the 20th century was essentially taking, you're removing human disturbance, and this is Skyline Drive in Shenandoah National Park. It was the first national park established to restore, not protect, wilderness. So it was denuded. It had been timber had been stripped off for lumber and for fuel for pig iron furnaces. So one of the major goals was to restore wilderness. And so in the process of doing that, they actually stopped disturbing it. And so as a kid, I thought this was an ancient forest, and it turns out it was probably 70 years old and at most. And so what was the difference is that there were no deer at the time. Pretty much deer had been eliminated and were not a factor up until the 1980s or so. And also there were very few invasive plants. So once humans stopped disturbing it, and they had not significantly disturbed the soil profiles in many cases, there was tons of seed, spore, roots, and biological material to basically recreate these systems. And as a result, you get these wonderful pockets with southern harebells and different you want Eupatorium purpureum, purple Joe Pye weed, and then Allegheny. This is Allegheny stone crop. So different native species that are endemic there, and they were recovered in profusion because their seed sources still persisted. Now, there are other cases where you're going to see disturbance. This is again Silver Lake Park. This was heavily disturbed in the 20th century. Incredible amount of invasive species, and the soil profiles are heavily damaged. So this without significant intervention is not going to recover in anybody's lifetime that's currently here. I wanted to give you a positive example though. So this is at Hidden Pond Nature Center in Springfield, and on the right, this is the stream that flows down to the pond, and on the right is the disturbed forest stand. It was disturbed probably 60 years ago. On the left, that was not disturbed, and they're only separated by about 10 feet of stream channel. Well, guess what? The understory on the right is 100% invasive, 0 invasives on the left. It is so dramatic. We were out there last year, and it was just like, it was incredible to see such a stark example of if you leave soil profiles intact, they can often resist invasion, even when those invasives have been there for decades, feet away. And I've seen this time and again. It's just very telling the importance of protecting these soil profiles. Another word that's critical to me in thinking about forest ecology is that our native plants co-evolved with insects as a primary thing, and of course supporting other species, include birds. And it's really critical to understand the coevolution and the relationship between insects and our native flora, because our angiosperms, or all of our flowering plants, originated about 140 million years ago with insects. And it is that coevolution over those 140 million years. It's so critical to understand because they can't switch. Doug Tallamy and others have demonstrated that after 400 years of some introduced species being here, they support almost no native insects. They will have some pests that can be found on them. Some of our introduced plants have what we call pests that will attack them, but by and large, they do not effectively feed our native insects, which are the fundamental trophic transfer mechanism to get energy from plants to everything else. So it's critical to understand this relationship. Our native insects are in tremendous jeopardy right now. A lot of our pollinators, which were primarily bees, some moths, are really in decline, as well as most other insects. And I think it's really important for us to understand that they call it a death by 1,000 cuts. There's so many different things affecting the insects, including the chemicals, and but primarily it's habitat disturbance. If we had more native flora, we'd have far more native insects, and that's the fundamental. That's the foundation of most of our systems. And then, with Doug Tallamy, I think in thinking about it, one of the things he's done very well is not only highlight those relationships, but also what should we do or can we do to help bolster those populations? And that is focusing on what he calls these keystone plant genera. So picking those species that support the most organisms. And you all are probably very familiar with this list. He started publishing this with Bringing Nature Home. It's also on the web pages now through his work and the work of others, but looking at those plant genre that really support the most organisms. Not all forests are equal. So pine stands, and this is Whitney Wildlife Management Area, Whitney Forest in Spotsylvania County, and it is or Oakley Forest. I apologize. For portions of it, they do have intact mixed hardwood forest and other forest types that are much more diverse, but there's significant stands of loblolly pine, and these support very little. You can see the understory photo on the lower right, where there's nothing growing. Basically, these are not diverse. They're not supporting wildlife, and it's kind of ironic to me. They call it a wildlife management area because really it's a tree plantation. On the other hand, also in Spotsylvania County, this is a Chancellorsville National Battlefield Park. This is an incredibly diverse, globally rare Piedmont depression swamp forest, and it's an amazing place. The primary plant here in the understory is Viburnum nudum, which is it's different. I'm trying to remember leatherleaf or different names for Viburnum nudum, but it's one of our native viburnums. That is a wetland plant, an obligate wetland plant. And it only occurs where you have good or better quality wetland conditions. So when you find Viburnum nudum profusion in a natural system, you're in a good system. This is a beautiful example. And here's another example. This is from King George County. This is a Caledon State Park. This is a coastal plain depression swamp forest. This is in good condition. So it has deer browse as a significant factor, but it has a wonderful grass dominant understory. And it has incredible number of wetland species. This is a good example of another diverse forest, or a rare forest type. Now, we often encounter things like this. And this is typical, trees over grass, low diversity overstory, introduced meadow or rather pasture and turf species that are mowed. So again, low diversity. Here's an example from Prince William County of an old forest buffer. And unfortunately, you can see the old pasture grass. In 100 years, this will still not be a forest. It's going to be trees over grass. And again, there's severe deer browse. It's a nice thought. And the intent was to promote water quality by producing a buffer where agriculture didn't come up to the stream, didn't work grazing cattle. But it does appear that they're excluding anything from this. Cattle may still be going in there. And it's really not providing any forest benefit. Very low diversity and no structure to it whatsoever. Here's an example from Arlington, actually looking from the GW Parkway out over the Potomac, downstream of Little Falls and Chain Bridge. And you can see all the sycamore. And what's this really telling me is this is a highly disturbed floodplain. It has low diversity overall, and it is not a high quality forest system. I'll put this in a high poor maybe quality system, but at least it does have an overstory that's pretty mature. As contrast, here's Pohick Bay Regional Park. Now it's been stripped bare by deer browse, but this is an intact forest system, good leaf litter, age class diversity, meaning it has trees of many different ages. And again, once I mentioned before, the very intact soil profiles. So even though it doesn't have maybe as high a quality as some systems that aren't deer browsed, this one, if you can reduce deer browse, you actually can recover it to a good or better quality system. It's still in a good condition. And this is an excellent quality. This is a northern red oak forest in Hidden Valley Wildlife Management Area, Washington County, Virginia. This is a high elevation system. It's above 3,500 feet, and it is an excellent quality system. It's incredible plant diversity and overall wildlife diversity. So thinking about what we can do, it's that kind of that classic thing about how we interact with landscapes. And I think so many of you have been involved for many years, and I know so many other people have, in trying to do the things that you see on the right of this image, which are trying to eliminate invasives, trying to prevent land use practices that are negative, trying to really plant native plants in. And it's everything from keeping cats indoors to trying to, on the other end, control deer herds, which is difficult. Worked with Alonzo and others in Arlington for years trying to help that process out. But it's just eliminating these practices on the left and trying to promote the practices on the right, positive land use actions. And then restoration, clearly it's a complex process. I think that you guys, the focus that you're doing was wonderful, trying to remove some of the stressors, the ones you can control, and trying to limit human disturbance, trying to eliminate invasive plant species wherever possible, and trying to reintroduce native plants wherever possible. So we're really trying to put function back in the landscape, and that function primarily is derived from native plants working in a system to restore soil profiles and support everything else. And that's really the thing we want to really promote the most. So thinking about reading landscapes, I use this as an exercise because one of the landscapes I worked in, this is in Colvin Run Stream Valley in northern Fairfax. When you start to look at the historic aerial images, you start to realize that you find intact forest stands and they've been there for decades. You can see it on the aerial photographs. So this is a modern aerial photograph. I'll show you in a minute. There's some darker, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but there's some darker tree cover right here. And when you start looking, in this case, this is a 1953 aerial. You see some remnant forest cover as where the bottom of the stream valley was denuded at the time for agricultural use. And you still see that in another image here, another historical aerial. And you can also see that it overlays with the topography, so steep slopes where it was harder to farm and it was left alone in forest cover. So lo and behold, when you walk that area today, there is some erosion and impacts from the upland uses. You can see the invasives here on the edge with smaller trees, some stilt grass. But then you get these really cool older stands with intact soil profiles and some age class diversity. And here the trees are younger, but still you can see they're kind of telling you when the deer browse really started in, because these trees are above the browse. But you can see that kind of that characteristic of intact soil profiles and different age classes. And again, these have been left alone largely for probably 50 to 60 to 70 years. And within these stands, it's interesting because like this tree here, you can tell it used to be on the edge of a field. It grew out and there was a field down towards the stream valley. So the clearing went down there. Younger trees are around it, but the soils were not as heavily disturbed. So the thing I wanted to bring up is this issue of human health associated with natural resource health and benefits of nature. So there's been a tremendous amount of work in the last several decades showing that indeed our contact with the natural world benefits our health, and that there are actually chemicals that are produced by native flora. If you're in forests or near water, there are these chemicals that actually improve our immune systems. They make us feel better. They improve our psychological condition. So it's incredibly important that we preserve and improve natural areas around us, and that directly benefits our own health. So there's another spinoff besides clean air, clean water, helping combat climate change, helping to support biodiversity. It's direct human health benefits. And I had a good example of this during the pandemic. I was living in a townhouse in Stafford County for the first part of it, and I had this view from my home office, and it was this wonderful remnant tree stand. It was actually good quality. It was very stable, had wonderful plants, and I'd have cool insects that would come out of it, and even things like ground skinks would show up, which are kind of uncommon reptile. And yeah, I saw so many things over a couple of years out this window. I got this photograph of an adult sharp-shinned hawk during one winter. It was really cool. So to me, the psychological benefit of having such a view was tremendous, and also being able to go out and interact with a good quality forest stand. So thinking about the difference between quality and stands, these are two parks in Fairfax that are about 2 miles apart, and they were the exact same ecosystem. The large trees are both chestnut oaks, and the understory in both cases is dominated by sassafras. But the difference is the one on the left was not disturbed throughout the 20th century. So it was left pretty much alone, uncut, no big soil disturbance. There was no real deer browse. And the deer actually have arrived there in the last probably 5 to 6 years in numbers. On the right is the exact same forest type, very fragmented. You can see a fence in the background. There's still grass in the understory. There's actually myelament and other vines coming in. It was heavily disturbed, and severe deer browse and invasive species are coming in. So it really gives you a contrast of what can happen with the same system and the same geographic location with different land use history, in terms of human activity and other stressors such as deer and invasive species. And again, this is the impacted system, and that's the system that's stable and intact. So there's a great contrast between their overall appearance, but they originated as the same type of system. So I think Edward Abbey's quote here is a nice one in terms of thinking about wilderness not as a luxury, but as a necessity. I mentioned before about its health benefits to us, but it really does so many things. We're learning that restoration of ecosystems is critical for combating climate change and supporting biodiversity and all the other ecosystem services we rely on, not just the other organisms that rely on with us. So protecting natural areas and thinking about all the things that live there. In the case here, we have a short-tailed shrew on the right. We've got periodical cicadas, which rely on these stable oak-dominant systems to support them through their 17-year dormant cycle for many of the broods. And then the Hercules beetle, which is really our largest local beetle, pretty amazing organism. This is a clear cut last year in Culpeper County. It was an oak hickory forest that was in good condition. The hope is that the soil disturbance wasn't so severe, and then they leave it alone and essentially let it regrow. And the question is, are there enough invasives close by? Will the deer browse be too severe? What other stressors will introduce themselves after this clear cut? And it really is telling. And again, it really depends on what the stressors are as to whether or not the system recovers. This is back to Silver Lake Park. This is a forest stand that's in poor condition that was heavily disturbed in the 20th century. And then just adjacent to it, here's another forest stand. And this here is very indicative of old clear cuts. You often, if the plants are cut so that the stump is 24 inches diameter less, it can resprout on multi-stem trees. So whenever you see multi-stem trees, you're looking at an old tree cut, a tree harvest. So in this case, these soil profiles are much more intact, and you have a much better quality system than in that previous slide where it was very disturbed. This is a cool house. This was, again, near that townhouse I lived in Stafford County. Much of the neighborhood was your typical development where they stripped off all the trees or left a few trees as ornamentals and put grass in. This particular house, they left most of the trees and the understory. It's a cool property because it's got a buffer around it of a kind of a remnant forest stand, but this is a typical suburban street, and this is a much better quality overall condition. And it's amazing to have that resource on a property, and these people are getting all the benefits of having a good quality forest stand on their own, normal size lot, as well as all the heating and cooling benefits, the privacy benefits, the overall health benefits of having this forest stand around them. So it's really a neat thing when you can see properties where this type of thing can be preserved, but also as an example of maybe the type of thing to work towards putting back over time in other properties. And this is a remnant in a property. This is a house I lived in for 14 years in Prince William. And this was just a little area where some trees had been removed, but the soils had not been disturbed. You had native strawberry, and you had pussy toads, and you had, in this case, twin leaf actually popped up, which is not common in Prince William County. So just back to that real quick, leaving those remnant areas with intact soil profiles and allowing the native species to come up. And you may have heard Rod Simmons talk in the past. Rod, an incredible botanist to me, he's talked numerous times about remnants in Arlington, Alexandria, where you find what he calls a native lawn under oak trees, where you've got poverty oats and a lot of native species that can persist very well under these kind of acidic conditions under oak trees. And it's really important to leave those intact and to try to recruit from those systems when you can. So I think just thinking back to butterflies, bees, and kind of their roles, I wanted to reiterate here too in forest ecology that there are about 14,000 lepidopteran species. And the key thing is about butterflies and moths. There are moths that are pollinators. Butterflies typically are not pollinators because they don't have hairy bodies to carry pollen. What they do, though, is they provide a tremendous percentage of the food for bird species, particularly in the spring and during raising young, but throughout the growing season. As their larvae are eating tree leaves, they are then in turn being eaten by birds in profusion. And that's a lot of the transfer of energy within forests. Meanwhile, there are about 4,000 bee species, which are primary pollinators. About 70% of those nest on the ground, and a lot of that is in forests. So I think this incredible importance of these intact forest stands for supporting all of this insect life in terms of the larvae of caterpillars and moths that then feed everything else. And bees are primary pollinators, which rely on these intact soil profiles for their nesting. And there's there's many other relatives, such as the cyprinid wasps, which rely on oak trees and form galls. And again, there's so much complexity within these stands in terms of the insect life and how they interact with each other, but also with plants. Caterpillars. So I mentioned before how important it is to have these intact forest stands for caterpillar production to feed everything else. And it's amazing. So that 35 times more caterpillar biomass on native plants versus non-natives, that's the Talmy number, but there's many other ones. And to include, songbirds consume 1 million caterpillars per day in a square mile of intact forest. 1 million per day. So that's that trophic transfer happening. So we've got an incredible number of caterpillars out there in our native trees and forests that are, again, critical for providing the food for everything else. There's your frass. It's a classic from a very large caterpillar. It was in my yard one day. So you're thinking about it raining frass. You can actually hear it in healthy woods during the growing season. You'll hear the poop from the caterpillars falling from the trees as they're eating. That's the frass that fall. And it happens all season long, different species, different times. This, as you may be well familiar, is the caterpillar of our native state butterfly, the tiger swallowtail. And they actually really, 3 stages of their life cycle occur in forests. So they rely on tree leaves for their food as a larva. Then once they pupate, they drop into the leaf litter. And then, of course, they emerge. And it's only after they emerge as an adult that they actually head for typical flowering plants in the open. So it's really important, I think, and emphasizing to people that 3 out of 4 life cycle stages of many of our butterfly species occur in the woods, as do many other insects. And this is your classic, typical lawn, collecting up all their leaves. You guys have probably seen this before, but It is so true. So much of what happens in woods happens in the leaf litter. So by removing all this organic material, you're removing a lot of the habitat and a lot of the biodiversity. So it's critical to leave the leaves. Just keep that material on site. Let sticks wherever you can. Leave that large woody debris. It's so important for supporting soil profiles and all the life that's associated with that. Plus, it fosters many other plant species. Here's your common natural condition. This is actually in the off of Massanutten Mountain, on the side of the mountain. But you see this woody debris and leaf litter, and this is what builds your soil profile. And this is where a lot of life happens. So many organisms live down this leaf litter. Your rotting logs are home to so many species. One of the things I've done in my career is done census for wildlife and small mammal populations. When you trap in the woods, you always know you trap along logs. And you do that when you're looking for small mammals, when you're looking for amphibians, when you're looking for reptiles. There's so many reasons why you look around the woody debris, because that's where a lot of life occurs. Here's some other animals. This is our broadhead skink, which is our largest local lizard, and they're very arboreal. They climb trees readily. They actually forage in trees, so they're very associated with tree cover and woods. So again, the diversity of life is often centered around intact treed areas. Here's a Fowler's toad on the left, which is one of our two common toad species, along with American toad. Here's a female of the common whitetail dragonfly, and a baby box turtle. Cecropia moths, another one that's very woodland dependent. I was fortunate one night to not only have Cecropia moths arrive, but to have both male and female, which is a real treat to be able to see them together, getting ready to mate. But again, dependent upon the forest for most of their life cycle. And then, of course, the mass that's produced. And it's funny, it's not just the common things we think about with mammals eating acorns. There's a tremendous number of insects that rely on acorns. And so, you pick up an acorn that's light, probably because it had weevils go into it. Actually eat much of the actual meat of the acorn itself. And then occasionally you get things like a great tree frog, which will occupy a bird nest box. Tussock moths, and there are large Io moths. And then this is an interesting treat. I came across last year. I had never seen this before. I first saw the adult. I thought it was something like a horsefly, but it turns out the tiger bee fly is a parasite on our carpenter bees. So you see those large bumblebee-looking bees or carpenter bees that bore into wood. Well, the tiger bee fly actually lays their eggs. The female lays their eggs in that hole, and the larva parasitize the larva of the carpenter bee, and they emerge to become this pretty beautiful fly here. So that's the kind of thing we get when we get diversity in our woodlands. And then just thinking about things like this is our plethodons, or this is the redback and leadback salamanders. They're in profusion in our woodlands, and they're I think they're the only amphibian in our area that actually lays its eggs away from the water underneath logs and woody debris. So the number of plethodons in your woods is really a good indicator of health in some cases. And the more plethodons, the merrier. I just wanted to point out some things in restoration that are pretty interesting. And I know that you were talking with Jen here, and you guys have a lot of experience with invasive control, but also methods. So this is in Lewinsville Park, and it is in Fairfax County. It's a very disturbed urban park, and it had an old field system which was periodically mowed. About 5 years ago, we planted, and it's experimental planting. We've got 5 sites in Fairfax like this, and we're planting more now, where we put kind of your typical plantation style planting with trees like 10-foot centers. You can see that on the left. It's got tons of invasive species. The trees are not necessarily growing very well. On the right, we're using what we call applied nucleation or cluster plantings. It turns out the trees survive better, grow faster, and within 5 years, they're suppressing the invasives by producing large quantities of leaf litter. So it's really, this is a growing area of research, but also probably one of the most important techniques we can use to start restoring systems more quickly, and also so that they're much more self-sustaining. So I wanted to, before I close here, again, come back to this concept of human health associated with good resource health. This is a pretty special place called Mott's Run Reservoir. It is in Spotsylvania County. It's a drinking water reservoir this creek flows to for the city of Fredericksburg. But this has got some really good quality forest stand components to it. It's a large system. And I had a personal story where several years ago, I was out hiking with a friend and I was having a very stressful time, and I'm walking around this reservoir, and it's a long hike. And I hadn't read much on the benefits of natural resources. I knew about them growing up and the biophilia concept and everything, but I just, as we walked, I was not only getting tired, but also I just felt my stress kind of stripping away. And thinking back on it, I was in a healthy forest system, breathing all these wonderful chemicals that the trees produce, and I can't help but think that my improved condition at the end of that walk not only was the stress itself and kind of the exertion, but also just breathing in that air, all those wonderful chemicals that are compounds that are beneficial for human health and been shown to be so, and having that benefit of that good quality resource. So this last quote here from E.O. Wilson, but in the background, there's also an intact system. It's actually another park, this one also in Prince William County, where my kids played soccer for years, and part of that park was in really good shape. So I walked there many times, and it has all the layers available. So with that, it's kind of what I wanted to share today, and I'm happy to take any questions and have any conversation you guys want to have.
There's a question in the chat. Louise says, could you please explain the applied nucleation idea again? She didn't quite get it.
Absolutely.
I
So
was going to ask the same thing.
yeah, and actually what I'll try to do is send Noreen this week. I'll send you my slides, but also try to send you more information on applied nucleation. So applied nucleation is a technique that was pioneered in the tropics. It's basically as you plant plants very densely. So rather than taking trees and putting them 10 feet apart, which is called a plantation style planting, that's the one you've seen all your lives. Every tree plantation you've seen, all the ones with little, the tubex protectors, those are all plantation style. It turns out in those conditions, they don't survive as well. There's a lot of herbaceous competition. They don't grow as quickly. They're not as vigorous. The applied nucleation or clump planting is you plant them very close together. So your trees themselves are probably 5 feet apart, but in between them, you've got other things planted, either understory trees or shrubs. So they're sometimes 3 feet apart or less. And you plant them in a clump that may be 12 feet by 18 feet. And what you find is that the plants themselves, they evolve to compete. So they're competing for light. And what happens is even though you would think that they're going to compete with each other and some will die off and some will make it. It turns out in that early stages of succession, those plants all do very well because there's good light availability and they're able to share the soil profile. And even though they are competing to some degree for nutrients and water, you're not planting so densely that there's not enough for all of them. So they tend to survive better. They grow faster. They also are recruiting the fungi they need to rebuild the soil profile. So not only are their roots growing, but they're establishing the mycorrhizal fungal network, which is lacking in those field systems. It's either it's lacking entirely because it's species that don't utilize mycorrhizal fungi, and or it's the wrong type of mycorrhizal fungi. It doesn't support trees. So these dense nucleated plantings or clump plantings they create nodes that mimic natural succession, where a tree would get established in a field, birds would bring in more seeds and establish trees around it, and slowly you create a node that would grow outwards. So this nucleation is assisting that process by putting the nodes in place and putting enough of them across a field complex so that eventually they grow up tall and they start to grow together. And that's the concept. And it's worked very well in the tropics. and we're applying it now here in the temperate regions, and it's also showing to be very successful.
Lori is asking if that's another term for the Miyawaki forest.
No, it's funny. There is overlap in this density issue. There's controversy around Miyawaki forests. They have been successfully used in a number of places worldwide. They're generally applied in very disturbed systems, but they're not generally applied to restore full forests. They are more in urban areas. They can be very successful in creating nodes in highly disturbed soil profiles near people. And one of the big differences is it relies on significant soil modification. So Miyawaki forests, they want you to turn the soils over, reintroduce put a lot of organic material into the soil, and then have a lot of upkeep for the first several years to make sure it gets off the ground. With the applied nucleation, that's not the case. You do not modify the soil profile. Instead, you're letting the plants do the work. So it's a lot cheaper. It can be applied across a much larger area, and it is much more effective at reforestation, as where the Miyawaki forests, I think, have been shown to be very effective in smaller footprints, particularly in more urban areas. So I think they're both applicable, but they're quite different in kind of how they function. I hope that's helpful.
This is Jennifer, and I'm just going to pipe in. Sometimes we've been doing the applied nucleation in Arlington, and we have been calling it Miyawaki because we're not doing that. All the parts of it, we're not doing the soil rebuilding and all those things. We're just planting a bunch of stuff really close together. So sometimes it gets called the Miyawaki in Arlington, but it's more what Charles is talking about. Just to kind of clarify that for people who know what we're doing in Arlington and what we're calling it, or other people.
Jen, how have your results been with those plants?
We only have one that's a little bit old. Vincent put one in Bluemont Park, and it's looking really good. And then we've done a few in the last few years where, again, just trying to plant densely, manage the invasives to some extent, and that's basically been the dense planting. We just did one in Bon Air. It's all still pretty small, and then they're doing some where there used to be a bunch of bamboo. So that's pretty tough soil. We'll see how well it works there.
Yeah, and that's a key too. Is it does take good planning. It's not easy. You all know this. It's not easy on a lot of these restoration projects. So it does take good planning. We have different methods for preventing deer browse in these with any restoration planting. Is how do you address deer browse? We can no longer use seedlings effectively in most cases because the deer will simply eat them if they're not protected significantly. So you really have to think out your restoration planting if you're doing that. The other thing I would really suggest is afforestation as opposed to reforestation in urban areas can be very applicable. So basically you have a remnant stand, and the key is to build off of that. Can you buffer that? Can you create an edge that's effective? Nature does not like horizontal and vertical. Nature likes lots of layers, and that's the most effective type of system in terms of providing ecosystem services and supporting biodiversity. So can you put in a good shrub edge? Can you start to augment that existing system? The other thing I talk about a lot, because I work with Audubon a lot at Home Ambassadors, you don't have to provide everything in the space you're working in. If there are large trees nearby, maybe your habitat is a different habitat type. Maybe you're going to provide something more of a meadow system or something more of a shrub system. What you want to try to do is look at the whole landscape, and it's a landscape mosaic, and it really doesn't care about property lines. So if the more types of different mosaics, but they have to be native plants. We need to get native plant biomass back in the system to the greatest extent possible. That's our real goal. And it has to be as stable as it can. With our goal long term is to reduce the number of inputs that we have to provide to have it function. So, and again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but these are all things we learn as we go. We try to share those lessons.
I've got a question about, with suppressed fire, natural wildflower fires in this area. How is that affecting the composition of the woods and the forests that we have around here?
It's a problem that we're not going to resolve soon. I would suggest that it's pretty clear, talking to the state plant ecologist for Virginia, that fire suppression is a big problem. That beech dominance in a lot of our systems is a problem. If you are not familiar, beech has a much lower overall wildlife support capacity. It also is mechanically allelopathic, meaning that it locks down the soil profile with its roots and suppresses other plants. So as beech becomes more and more dominant, it's a good example of basically dumbing down the system. And beech is being selected for because it's very shade tolerant. It's not preferred by deer, but also we are suppressing fire. So a really direct impact of fire suppression, along with some other factors, is beech dominance. So that's a good example. And the years ago, I attended a talk by trying to remember the gentleman's name now, but he was considered the leading fire ecology expert on the East Coast. And basically in eastern forests determined that pre-suppression, that natural fires would occur every 15 to 20 years in forest systems. And it's very well documented that fire actually promotes oak hickory regeneration as well as suppressing beech. So I do think that fire suppression is a problem, but clearly in dense urban areas, we're not going to get around that anytime soon. So it's not one of the fights we can really take on. I think it is this invasive control, preventing human disturbance, and then hopefully some deer herd reduction. So
I have one more question, but first, does anybody else have any questions? I know it's a couple minutes after 9 now, but anybody else have any questions? Maybe not. Well, I just have a quick question, if you can answer it. I know it's a complicated subject, but if you can just answer it in a nutshell. When you're doing a forest or a restoration project, how do you decide what trees to put into a particular site that you're trying to restore?
that is a great question, and it depends answer. There's a couple thoughts. I think we've made a lot of mistakes in the past of trying to plant only late succession species. So when you have basically a denuded site, basically pretending it's going to be a late succession forest overnight is kind of a false premise. So consider using some early succession species mixed with the late succession species. So, for instance, we think of oak hickory forests. They are kind of the pinnacle for music mixed hardwood forests. They have the highest biodiversity support. But you might also want to consider having some species in there that can grow quickly, get some shade up, and then help the other trees kind of come along. And this does really well in the applied nucleation. One of the things I've done over years is looked at successful naturally occurring sites along roadways, old vacant lots, even cemeteries where you've got stable plant populations that have done really well. One of my coworkers experimented with using black locusts. So clearly an early succession species, not palatable to deer. It is a nitrogen fixer. So can you mix that in with your palette? We've really tried to put eastern red cedar into our palettes. Eastern red cedar is not only it's not palatable by deer, it turns out it has an incredible root system that tends to break up hardpan better than a lot of others. So it's very possible that eastern red cedar, as a component of your plant palette, if you have a denuded site, could be very positive, not only providing early habitat benefits, but also for helping to prep the soil for greater succession over time. I will also say that what we do is we try to inventory the surrounding system. What is there that's left? We generally map all the vegetation. So we use the Virginia Natural Heritage plant communities. If you've never been on their website, they've got a phenomenal website which shows you all the natural communities of Virginia. You can also download the data from all the plots they've taken across the state. And what those plots tell you is what the species composition is. So you can look at the plots closest to your area of that community type. So music mixed hardwood being our most common, you can find the plots from our area of Northern Virginia and use the actual data from the plots as a base palette to look at. Okay, here's the type of species that would commonly be found in this type of forest. So I really want to try to draw off that palette to some extent. Again, maybe use also some early succession species to start to build my palette. So I think there's a lot of different answers to that. Then the other thing is, what are you going to do to manage while it's growing in? You know, what is your management scheme? And when you're picking your plants, you also have to think about how you're going to protect them, how you're going to, for instance, with woody plants, you need to suppress herbaceous plants around them. So there's really good data out of the Stroud Center from Pennsylvania on forest buffer plantings that suppressing herbaceous plants for 3 to 5 years greatly helps the success and growth and vigor of woody plants. So that's why applied nucleation or clump planting actually helps again, because it's easier to clump them and then suppress them with like a mulch layer around that clump. And then you can mow if you need to suppress invasives around the clumps. So if you put them all dispersed throughout the field, you're basically taking mowing off of the map in terms of a management tool. So things like that, in addition to your species palette, is how you're going to manage it during the grow in. It's very helpful.
Okay, thanks. I see Jen put the website or the link rather for novanaturalcommunity.com in the chat.
Yeah, that's Glenn's sort of, I don't want to say it's a simplification, but if you haven't had Glenn Tobin talk about the work he did with that, it was taking a lot of the state heritage classifications, looking particularly at Northern Virginia, and trying to make it more accessible to the average person, the data in it. So it's a great resource for people who are trying to figure out what plant community they have around them and if they're looking at restoration projects. So
yeah,
but
that's a good point, because
Charles said the state is the real source of all that.
Yeah.
But Glenn is, I think it's a little more accessible for the average person what he did there. So.
That's great. And to tell you the truth, it's a really good point, because what we find is even when you're mapping communities, unless you have something rare or particularly unusual, you're usually dealing with a handful of different community types that are the most dominant in our area. So kind of once you get a feel for them, it really makes a difference. I would suggest it's, in addition to identifying the plant community, it's understanding what's in good condition versus what's not in good condition, and picking your battles is often one of the most important things. And I've heard this from numerous people, including the folks that are in the prism that works out of the Shenandoah Valley. I've been on some of those properties, and I think people started with really impacted properties, and then they're really having a difficult time working on the invasives because they started with a poor quality system that had high soil disturbance. So I think picking your battles, look at your system and understand kind of the disturbance regime. How long ago was it disturbed? How badly was it disturbed? Where are your intact core areas? Protecting the cores first is always the first lesson, I think. The good things should be protected first and then build outwards. But anyway, there's so many cool things about that. But I think that's really good that, again, learning to identify the plant communities, but also the condition the communities are in.
Okay, yeah. Well, thanks. There's several people in the chat saying thank you both, and excellent presentation, great presentation, so forth and so on. So thank you very much, both of you, and thank you for splitting the bill tonight.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of
actually your talks complemented each other very well. It was really truly great doubleheader.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and I agree. Okay, well, thanks. If nobody has any other questions, I guess we'll see you next week. And do I hear somebody trying to chime in?
I was going to say thank you, Noreen, for organizing this and putting the two ideas together and getting us here. So.
Oh, well, I think I'm glad you think it worked out fine. So that's good to hear. Okay, well, thanks again to both of you. And good night, everybody.
That's good.
Night.
Take care. Night.
Right.
Let's see. Oh, I was going to say there's
Good
more
night.
messages, but it's just more people saying thank you. Okay, so good night.